The history of Ukraine has always been a history of struggle and fight for independence. Back at the beginning of 20th century, during the First World War, Ukraine was really close to gaining independence and we could even say temporarily had it. However, because of a great turmoil, as many different factions were fighting for the political power rather than trying to properly cooperate, this didn't really work out. At school, normally we would learn about Ukraine's People Republic, the Second Hetmanate, which Pavlo Skoropadsky was leading, or the Directorate led by Vinnychenko and Petlura, because those were considered to be more like canon, pro-Ukrainian political powers at the time before they got crushed by Bolsheviks. However, I think the person that really got overlooked during this time, who has been also shunned by all the sides because of his political views and ideology, nonetheless, who's been the true patriot to his at least hometown and maybe homeland, Guerrilla, which was the prominent anarchist Nestor Makhno. Nestor Makhno is most likely could be described as the Robin Hood of Ukraine at his time. He's coming from a very impoverished family. His father died when he was just 1 year old. He himself was the youngest child in the family, and just he had to work from the very early ages in life. That was even his decision. So he spent like a couple of years at school, which wasn't his favorite thing at the time. And since age of 10, he already started to work in the field and was livestock. And this is very important to mention because of his further ideological and the worldview was predominantly based on this, as well as the stories that his mother was telling about the times when his parents were under serfdom. Even though the serfdom was already abolished at the time, technically it wasn't. The peasants didn't really have much more rights, or better to say, didn't really see a lot of life improvement from what they used to have. An incident in which he saw another fellow worker for one of the landowners being beaten up for no good reason planted the seeds of injustice with the whole system, from him still being quite in his early teens. Later over time, he joined in the Anarchist group in Halaipale and was really excited about doing his little political things. He's being propagandist, the person trying to spread the message about how this whole society needs to be revolutionized and changed. And for quite a while, they've been doing their things undercover, and nobody really noticed it all that much until their group killed the police informant that they had. So, because of this, most of the group members who got caught were executed, but because Makhno at the time was still pretty young, he was around 20, instead he was incarcerated and sent to prison for the rest of his life. Technically, you could think that it was have been more humane, but the main reason was that him being young and healthy was proven to be a great resource that could be used to, a free power. At that time, another way of slavery when, the prisoners were doing certain things pretty much for nothing. So first he spent a year in Yekaterinoslav prison, nowadays Lugansk, and then was sent to Butyrka in Moscow, which was predominantly a prison for all the political captives. And this was the time where many things happened to him. So he got more exposed to other political movements or other ideologies. He was more exposed, for example, Ukrainian nationalism, which he didn't necessarily share. He really felt like much more of an internationalist, I think being super heavily influenced by the socialist and anarchist studies, which were predominantly not focused on one nation and trying to speak more on behalf of all the worker class rather than a specific nation. So despite him learning a bit more about Ukrainian nationalism, him being a Ukrainian himself, he didn't necessarily share the view on this, but I think that's still kind of ingrained a little bit of a thought in him about his own nation, which later is important, I think, to point out. Also, during this time, he died of tuberculosis, which haunted him till the rest of his days. Again, as I said, so him already sort of being an anarchist, he started to learn more during his prison times by reading probably one of the most important books in the anarchist library, which is the book by Kropotkin. And despite him, trying to do all the things that the intellectual would do, reading a lot of books, learning more, writing some stuff, him being, not illiterate, because of course he could read and write, still not that well educated because of having just a year of school education, and the rest was pretty much taken up as he was going through his life. Him being close to, some of the people who were imprisoned with him were this intellectual elites, and he really grew some repulsement towards them that is mainly coming from the discrimination that the prison guards were having towards the intellectual, like more aristocratic, you could even say, prisoners who were sitting together with him, and people like him, just the regular peasants or workers who were also, despite sharing the views and ideology, still technically being the political prisoners. They were treated way worse than those intellectual inmates. In 1917, the revolution happened, and all the political prisoners that were sitting at the time in Butyrka were released, Makhno including, and he happily returned to Gallipoli, and this is pretty much where we're starting to see his memoirs coming to life. The memoirs at this point, probably forever will be just 3 books where they are talking about the span of just pretty much 2 years of his life. The very first book was written fully by himself, not edited, published while he was in his exile in Paris. While you read this, you definitely can see that the book is lacking more, literature way of expressing themselves. There is a lot of weird repetitions or things that could have been omitted. Like, I don't have much experience with reading memoirs and diaries of sorts. And despite Makhno trying to do his best, I think, to point out the very important things, sometimes he was lacking the emphasis, and sometimes from the very first book, it would just seem that he was doing some pro-anarchist propaganda. He found some other people who were sharing his views, and he would debate and argue with people with other views. And it's not necessarily action-packed, this very first book. It, of course, puts a ground layer towards establishing him further as a person, but it's not extremely well written. Despite that, I think it is important to still check how he was thinking, because during describing different events, and even though they could be written in a pretty plain style, he's still sharing his thoughts on very different events and ideologies that's been coming around. Already closer to the end of the book, we see him leaving Gallipoli, sort of technically losing to the powers of Ukraine's People Republic, who were claiming to be socialist. However, Makhno didn't accept any forms of government. That is why he wasn't really getting on well with this party, including, because what it also turned out to be, the UPR signing a treaty with Germany and Austria didn't really look good on their claims of being a pro-socialist government. So it mainly looked that they tried to, seize the power, keep the status quo. They become the new elites and having all the things. It was a really, really weird times, to put it this way. So Makhno leaving Helipoli, a lot of his comrades were imprisoned, and there is quite a significant part of the book, of the first and the second one at the beginning, where we learn that the reason why the Helipoli was so easily taken, because there was a Jewish group that was on duty on that specific day, and it ended up that they sort of betrayed the people of Helipoli, or more like betrayed the sympathizers to Makhno, because Makhno at the times he sort of took a control of Helipoli, and I think the whole ideology of anarchism is similar to libertarianism, so there is no one for people to tell what they need to do. And it worked kind of well with the peasants, because what it really meant is that everybody needs to own the amount of land that they will be able to work on themselves without hiring anybody new. So everybody is kind of having their means to be fully independent, so to say, from growing their crops and seeds. And they're even going all the way back almost to the natural exchange time, when there wasn't really a market economy of any sorts. And I suppose the idea wouldn't go as far that people would just exchange their crops that they grow for some other crops or other things that other people were making. Could have been the case. In this sense, it was like the first poke at trying to build this libertarian sort of society. Makhno was de facto the leader of people, and he even pointed out himself that this is not necessarily the role he ever considered himself to be, and he feels a bit weird, and that is contradicting with his anarchist views. However, during this turmoil that has been happening, he felt like it was necessary for people to sort of lean on someone, and he was fine with taking this responsibility. But all people are full with the contradictions of their sorts. Makhno is definitely not the first and not the last of us. So Makhno is leaving Helipoli, and it ended up that the Jewish group that was on duty at that time succeeded their power to the Ukraine's People Republic and the Germans with Austrians, who unfortunately imprisoned all the anarchists who were with Makhno, including his brother, as well as they were razing and pillaging the village too, because they sort of need to get a punishment for not being obedient to the new government. There were also other reasons. Of why, for example, there was a little insurrection that happened that Germans and Austrians, mainly Germans, did by putting new hetman Skoropadsky to lead the Ukraine, who was much more on the same terms in terms of the ideology and political views as the the capitalist West, who was much more radical in terms of the retaining the old monarchy style with dealing with the regular people, and he himself being one of the aristocrats and one of the big landowners, of course, he couldn't resist the temptation to still keep all the means of production and land to himself, together with other people who were also wealthy and didn't like what all these socialist movements were doing during the revolution. Makhno went to Taganrog, from where he again had a little bit of a conference where they reconciled the powers of the anarchists, which was really small, to be honest. And they claim that he's gonna go back to Helipoli and will try to fight back and resist the new government and bring peace and punish all the counter-revolutionists, as he's been calling them. So he had a little bit of a voyage on Volga all the way to Moscow, and he was utterly disappointed that the anarchist movement pretty much everywhere was broken. And he blamed Bolsheviks for that, who were actually ideological enemies, because despite them, of course, sharing the similar socialist view on life, Bolsheviks ended up becoming the new intellectual layer, like the new elites, which Anarchist Makhno didn't really agree with, and sort of felt that this was something, then the whole idea of how he believes the society needs to be formed should not be the case. When he was already in Moscow, he even met with Lenin, and I think it's also interesting to know that, remember, his exposure to Ukrainian nationalism still kind of make him a bit more proud about being a Ukrainian. So whenever Lenin and other big dogs in Bolsheviks movement were usually referring to Ukraine as the South Russia, he would normally correct them to say that this is Ukraine, which something that I think not a lot of people expected from Makhno, because he really became an ideological enemy for everyone. So he was enemy for Bolsheviks, even though they were temporary allies. He, of course, was against the Ukraine People Republic, Hetmanate, Central Directoria, mentioning all three of these because they succeeded each other within almost 6 months. The new government was forming, and the turmoil was real. And of course, he was fighting the White Army, he was fighting Germans, Austrians. He didn't really have many allies himself, maybe some other bandits, as they could be called, for example, the Nikifor Grigoriev, who made some kind of a bandit state in Kherson. So Makhno ended up going to Ukraine. He needed to get a fake passport, otherwise he would have been caught straight on the border, which he successfully got. He was offered to go to Kharkiv instead of Gallipoli, and everybody kind of saw that he was crazy. And this is the part where it all starts to look like some kind of a movie-like story. So everybody's telling him he's crazy to go back to Gallipoli that's already under Ukraine, People Republic control, or Hetmanate control at this point. He was really willing to protest and revolt against them and, bring back the peace to his beloved hometown. So took his fake passport. He got as closer to the neighboring village from Gallipoli to not get caught. He even once described an event when he had to dress up as a woman to go through the daylight so he wouldn't get caught by the militia, which making this almost spy-like story with these guys and this sort of stuff. Then, of course, he successfully found his old friends, some of whom were returning to Ukraine too. They all successfully started a revolt in Gallipoli. They recaptured it, and this is where pretty much the whole fight of Makhno movement starting, so-called Makhnovshchina. His deeds were really known by peasants all around the country and specifically all around the region where he's initially from. That's why he sort of always felt welcome whenever he's been coming to liberate those other villages and bring them the anarchist, libertarian way of life. So he had no huge issues with, for example, getting and finding food. There was a shortage of weapons. There were no shortage of people wanting to enlist into his army, trying to, go out and fight for the rights of the peasants. He made some allies, and even some of these small bandit armies became a part of his own. There was this interesting, almost like a movie-like incident happened when they dressed up as German soldiers, and they entered one of the manors of the newly reestablished mass landowner, who first lost his manor and then he got it back, and then the old regime kind of came back to him, and then he of course accepted the Makhno with his army coming into his manor, gave them food and gave them stuff, and then he started to say something like, "Oh my god, this Makhno guy is again appearing, I'm so glad that you guys are here to protect me." And then Makhno is like taking out his pistol, pointing out at him and saying, "Look, I am Makhno. Put all the weapons and food here and nobody will get hurt." This this landowner was a bit both relieved and not relieved. Of course, he's tried to make use of inspiration and started to mention, "Oh, actually, guys, I like you," but it never works. It never works, guys, like this. And so this guy actually provided some weaponry to them, and they didn't. This guy's family pretty much stayed alive. It's a good thing. So also Makhno, what's important for him is that not only he's not really sharing any forms of nationalism, he also wasn't sharing any forms of discrimination in this sense. And as I already mentioned, there was this Jewish group that helped the UNR to get control of Helipoli. And he had pretty much hard time explaining to his soldier that anti-Semitism is not okay, that these Jews, they were manipulated into believing that they should help this other group, political group, so they get more rights over there, which they, of course, didn't really. So he's been constantly against anti-Semitism, and this turned out to be quite an important topic that he mentioned a few times in his memoirs. That is why some of the allies that he made along the way, he also had to renounce. Like this same Nikifor Grigoriev, who was not supporting necessarily anti-Semitism, who was an anti-Semit, and they didn't see anything bad about killing and robbing Jews, and for them it was part of what they sort of been doing, and Makhno couldn't be allies with such a person for a really long time, to put it this way. Despite him already becoming quite an influential person in the Zaporozhye region, or I think at that time Zaporozhye was called Alexandrovsk. So he already became a power to be reckoned with, and at the time already central directorate with Volodymyr Vinnychenko and Simon Petlura. For the third time, there was this change of power in Ukrainian politics, which of course doesn't mean that anything good is coming usually out of it. One of the important moments also is how Makhno got his nickname Batko Makhno, Batko meaning a father, and it was also so many things are so much heroic in this sense, is that they liberated the village of Debrivki, and after doing that and successfully defending it from German and Austrian forces, just some random dude told him, "Batko Makhno, we going with you, whenever you take us, we gotta fight for our right with you, we're gonna fight for you." And that's how he got his nickname, and became widely called as Batko Makhno moving forward by all his troops. And even though he felt like this was extremely honorable for him to be called like this, he still sometimes would mention that he doesn't felt comfortable, that it's still not sitting well with his anarchist views. But the story, his memoirs, stop in 1919, pretty much at the very beginning of his Makhno movement. And the rest, I had to learn myself from other sources, because he didn't really have much of a diary left. So he didn't really do much of a diary, and I understand there was much more crazy things that were going on during that time. He pretty much had a temporary agreement with the Bolshevik government that they were allies for quite some time. However, he ended up renouncing their allyship because of how much power and influence he already started to get, and still how much of a ideological differences they were having between these two political movements. That is why he continuously opposed the Bolsheviks, and clearly, as Bolsheviks were opposing White Army, he's been opposing White Army, who are completely on a different spectrum of his political views. So pretty much at this point, Makhno was surrounded by the enemies, and there were some successes, there were some shortcomings that he's been having, and as a very last attempt, he tried to siege Kharkiv, which didn't prove to be successful, and he had to flee. And they were fleeing all the way through the south, through like Kherson, Odessa, all the way to Romania, with a small group of soldiers that he's been having, and they were chased by the Bolsheviks all the way quite until the border, and at one of the later fights, Makhno got a bullet wound in his neck, which, something not really nice to get. So he was pretty much not incapable to continue fighting, but his men made sure that he moved over the border, and then further in like Bucharest, he was trialed and imprisoned, then got free, then moved to Poland, trialed, imprisoned, moved, and then moving through Poland to Leipzig, and from Leipzig he finally found his final refuge in Paris, where also a lot of political leaders of many sorts found their exile there. He even said that he never imagined that his last years in life he would be surrounded by his enemies. Because Simon Petlura also was in Paris, and there was another incident relating to Simon Petlura, who also has been quite a big anti-Semite and part of the pogroms. There was a Jewish extremist who killed Simon Petlura, even though Makhno was trying to prevent this from happening, because, he, regardless of him having a reputation of a bandit and having a reputation of, still this person being his political enemy, I think the whole idea of people living more or less in peace stick with him more. And he had some friends over in Paris, which unfortunately he started to losing. He's became more grumpier, and he's been extremely unhealthy. His tuberculosis really was killing him. He's been malnutrition because all the little money he had, he tried to spend on his daughter and booze. He's been getting like a stipend from the France government, which was at the size half of the minimum wage. So he barely could survive at a point of a time, and relying partly on his friends, on other anarchists who were living there, with whom he broke many pots, and ended up trying to earn some money writing his memoirs, which didn't sell well at all. And he just passed away in 1934. Yeah, because of the cited reason of malnutrition and tuberculosis. So Makhno is quite an interesting historical figure, to put it this way. I think he was a man who seemingly tried to fight with injustice the way he saw possible, and the way he was considered that it needed to be, I think, of course, me being influenced by his memoirs, where he constantly contradicts himself, just like, like regular people normally do, make me more compassionate towards him on a personal level, even though, his memoirs are kind of crude and not super emotional. You could say that even the memoirs are sort of a propaganda in a way that he probably wouldn't put himself in a bad light. But I think his deeds are at least worth mentioning for the history. And I think despite him sort of being this rebel against everyone, it's quite a fascinating story that happened in the steppe of Ukraine. I hope I was able to explain some of the things about Nestor Makhno, and I hope you liked the video. If you did, give a like, leave a comment, and let me know what do you think about him. Maybe I missed some important events that would completely change anyone's opinion about him. So yeah, let me know. Have a great rest of your day, and bye.